Thanks, Hugh, and good morning, everyone. Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon are still deadlocked at this moment in the count of popular votes in the election of the 37th President of the United States. And the tabulations show there is still doubt whether either one can get the 270 electoral votes needed to win in the Electoral College. If both fail, the choice of the next president would fall to the House of Representatives. With 88% of the popular vote counted, Humphrey had 43% and Nixon had 43%. George Wallace had 14%. The computers gave Nixon 195 electoral votes, Humphrey 166, and George Wallace 45. Again, remember, 270 are needed. The struggle has rivaled the 1960 razor-edge finish when Nixon lost to John F. Kennedy. The outcome hinged on final results still to come from three key states, California, Ohio, and Illinois. It has been a night of high tension at the Nixon and Humphrey headquarters. Richard Nixon went to bed at his suite in New York's Waldorf Towers without making a statement, but Hubert Humphrey went to his Minneapolis headquarters at 2:30 in the morning to say that he was at ease, but as he put it, anything can happen. And George Wallace, in a late-night statement at Montgomery, Alabama, said, "It's not over yet."
Some members of my family have already seen fit to retire in confidence, and others have decided to stay up. But we have, as you know, several of the very important states that are nip and tuck, where the decision, I'm sure, will not be known until sometime at least late tomorrow. And if you want to stay up to wait for all of that, I'm all for you. But you've been watching the television, and you've been listening to the reports. And I believe that it's fair to say that we have done much better than most observers had thought we would, and about as good as I thought we would. Now, I tell you, you know me, and you know that I'm generally a rather optimistic man. And tonight I feel that way. I feel that this election has been not only a rewarding experience for me, but I feel that by the time that the turn of day comes tomorrow, that you and I are going to be a lot happier and much more cheerful than we are even tonight. Thank you very much.
I thank all of you who are here tonight for the great part you played not only in our movement in Alabama, but having made it possible to go into other states of the Union, and for the first time in our lifetime to place our party on the ballot in all 50 states. And you can rest assured that this movement has had its impact because of you. And it looks now that we're going to get several millions of votes in the country, and it means that we have spoken for a large segment of the American public. And in fact, as Governor Griffin said, during this campaign, both candidates began to sound as if they had found some speeches written by those of us here in the Coliseum tonight. So to conclude my remarks here, let me say to the press and to the news media that the election is not over yet.
We'll have more news in just a moment. The time now is 24 minutes before the hour. And right now, here's Hugh with what we think is a very happy message.
Yes, a couple of times each week, Barbara, Frank, Joe, and myself take a minute to talk with you about the big lift drink, milk. And I can't think of a more wholesome, healthy, and happy kind of beverage to talk about at that time of day or any time. Milk is truly like apple pie and corn on the cob and mother and all that. It's everything good. And sometimes I think we should take it a little more seriously, though, because your health and your family's health is the most important thing in the world. And here we have nature's most nearly perfect food to help you stay healthy, to give you a lift that lasts. You see, when you drink milk with meals and snacks, you don't just get quick energy. and vitality to get you going, but you get it that keeps you going. And here's the important thing to remember. Most adults still need to drink milk, at least 2 full glasses every day. Now, if you aren't a milk drinker, you're missing something. You're missing a big lift that lasts. The American Dairy Association hopes that you'll enjoy milk today. All right, it's 22 and a half before the hour now. Back to Frank Blair.
The Democrats retain control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, despite some Republican gains. With the counting still incomplete, the Democrats had 243 seats in the House and the Republicans 192 seats. In the Senate, the Democrats had 56 seats and the Republicans 40. Barry Goldwater, out of office for 4 years after losing the 1964 presidential election to Lyndon Johnson, will be back in Washington, replacing 91-year-old Senator Carl Hayden, the Arizona Democrat who did not run for re-election. Everett Dirksen, the colorful Senate Minority Leader, was returned to office by his Illinois constituents. J. William Fulbright, the Arkansas Democrat who was one of the original doves on Vietnam, won re-election to the Senate. And Adam Clayton Powell, the Negro representative who has had so much trouble with his colleagues, was once again returned to his House seat by Harlem voters. For the first time in history, a Negro woman was elected to the House of Representatives. Shirley Chisholm, a 43-year-old former school teacher, won on the Democratic ticket in one of the nation's worst slum districts, the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. And now, summing up the election vote counting at this moment, Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon are deadlocked in the count of popular votes, with 88% of the results now in. Neither has yet won enough electoral votes to be assured of victory in the Electoral College. And at this moment, 3 big states, California, Illinois, and Ohio, appear to hold the key to the final outcome. Of course, we'll continue and bring you late developments as they happen. The time now is 21 minutes before the hour, and here's Barbara with a word about the National Observer.
In today's fast-paced world, especially on a day like today, we realize that women must be able to talk about a lot more than just babies and recipes. And that's why so many women have found the National Observer to be just what the doctor ordered. It's a new kind of national weekly newspaper for the whole family. And quickly, quietly, without scare headlines, it keeps you informed in the nation and the world, the arts and sciences, books, sports, travel, entertainment, elections, and much more. The National Observer not only tells you what is happening, but also why. And you'll also find that the National Observer will provide your whole family with a lot of news you can use, practical news to help you get more out of living. And if you act today, you can take advantage of the special trial subscription offer. The next 20 weekly issues sent to your home for only $2.67. You send no money, just your name and address to the National Observer, Box 88, New York, New York 10017. That's the National Observer, Box 88, New York, New York 10017. Now we'll return to Frank with the weather.
Well, more than half of the nation will be under clouds this day after Election Day. The area of snow and rain is very large, but fortunately, the moisture supply has been spread rather thin, and most rain or snowfall amounts will be light. The low center is over southern Illinois, moving up to the Ohio Valley tonight and on through the northeast tomorrow. Today, the rain area will reach from Kansas and Missouri to Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, western West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, to lower Michigan and Wisconsin. The light snow area reaches from the central Rockies to Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and northern Wisconsin in upper Michigan, and severe thunderstorms today are possible from Louisiana and Mississippi into Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. The Atlantic states will have increasing clouds, and the far west will hold fair. That brings us to 18 minutes before the hour. Hugh? Everyone, this is what's been happening. Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon are still deadlocked in a monumental struggle for the presidency at this moment in the counting of popular votes from yesterday's election. Two big states, California and Illinois, appeared to hold the key to the final outcome, and Nixon was slightly ahead in all three. And at this hour, with 88% of the popular vote counted, Nixon had 43%, and Humphrey also 43%. George Wallace had 14%. There is now some doubt whether either man can get enough electoral votes to win in the Electoral College. However, Nixon now has 261 electoral votes projected, and Humphrey 166 and Wallace 45. 270 are needed. If no candidate gets 270, then the choice of the next president could be decided in the House of Representatives. Nixon remained secluded through the night in his suite at the Waldorf Towers in New York City. Humphrey, however, appeared at his Minneapolis headquarters at 2:30 in the morning and acknowledged that, as he put it, anything can happen, while Wallace, in a late-night statement, still refused to acknowledge defeat.
Some members of my family have already seen fit to retire in confidence, and others have decided to stay up. But we have, as you know, several of the very important states that are nip and tuck, where the decision, I'm sure, will not be known until sometime at least late tomorrow. And if you want to stay up to wait for all of that, I'm all for you. But you've been watching the television, and you've been listening to the reports, and I believe that it's fair to say that we have done much better than most observers had thought we would, and about as good as I thought we would. Now I tell you, you know me, and you know that I'm generally a rather optimistic man. And tonight I feel that way. I feel that this election has been not only a rewarding experience for me, but I feel that by the time that the turn of day comes tomorrow, that you and I are going to be a lot happier and much more cheerful than we are even tonight. Thank you very much.
I thank all of you who are here tonight for the great part you played, not only in our movement in Alabama, but having made it possible to go into other states of the Union, and for the first time in our lifetime to place our party on the ballot in all 50 states. And you can rest assured that this movement has had its impact because of you. And it looks now that we're going to get several millions of votes in the country, and it means that we have spoken for a large segment of the American public. And in fact, as Governor Griffin said, during this campaign, both candidates began to sound as if they had found some speeches written by both of us here in the Coliseum tonight. So to conclude my remarks here, let me say to the press and to the news media that the election is not over yet.
As for the vice presidential candidates, Edmund Muskie said he urgently hoped the decision would not go to the House. Spiro Agnew said he was optimistic, and General Curtis LeMay said the third party had done better than generally expected.
Seems to be so close that the chances appear to be increasing that the election may be thrown either into the Electoral College or into the House of Representatives. Does that frighten you?
Well, I think it would be better for the country if we could decide the election one way or another today, because I think to leave it undecided for weeks or months could create a great deal of unrest throughout the country, which might be harmful. I gather that about 35% of the vote is in, at least it was when I left the motel, and that if it goes into the House, it'll be for a reason we didn't anticipate. That is, the Wallace vote isn't really as strong as we thought it might be. And so if it goes into the House, It'll go into the House because the two leading candidates are so close in so many parts of the country.
It is a rather late hour, isn't it? Something like 25 minutes of 4. And I guess everyone has been watching with as much interest as I have back at Government House, and it's perfectly obvious to anyone that the results are inconclusive at the moment. I do feel that trends are developing that are very helpful to the ticket, and I feel most optimistic. I've talked with Mr. Nixon on the phone just about 10 minutes ago. He shares my feeling that these trends are developing in a most satisfactory way for us. We certainly aren't predicting at this moment a victory. We are feeling to some extent encouraged beyond what we expected to be at this hour. I want to express my appreciation to the people here and the people across the country for the wonderful support they've given the team. And I would guess that there'll be no substantive announcements, conclusive announcements this evening. I imagine we'll have to go a few more hours before we get to that.
I believe that before any balloting took place, that I'd accomplished most of my goals. Certainly, we've made a tremendous impact on the country that's going to be felt for a long time. If you add the popular vote of the American Independent Party with the Republican Party, the last figures I saw came nearly 60% of the American people who are dissatisfied with the trend toward socialism that we've encountered in the past 8 years. Before the end of the evening, as a matter of fact, I think it'll be in tomorrow before we really know, it may turn out the American Independent Party is more important than we ever thought it would be.
We'll continue with our reports on the election returns in just about 2 minutes. This is Today on NBC. Extremely close, with both men getting 43%. George Wallace finished far behind, winning 5 states in the Deep South with 45 electoral votes. And while the up and down vote count went on, Edmund Muskie spent election night with his family at Waterville, Maine. For a report on the mood in the Muskie camp, we go to David Burrington at Muskie's headquarters. No, we're not ready with Muskie yet. Well, I have to find that one. I thought that was the one we didn't have. Anyway, all right. So we'll go to Mr. Muskie after a while, but right now, Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon's running mate, had told newsmen only yesterday that he hoped to win, but he put it this way, he was fully prepared to lose, too. For a report on the Agnew camp, we switched to Charles Quinn at Agnew headquarters in Annapolis, Maryland.
Spiro Agnew is sleeping now, or at least he was up until a little while ago, we're told. He went to bed soon after he made a brief appearance here in the ballroom of the Statler Hilton in Annapolis about, several hours ago. At the time, he said he was confident the Republicans were winning, and in fact would win. This confidence was shared, but not without some doubts, by about 200 partisans who cheered him at what he called that outrageous hour. Agnew watched the results from his quarters at the governor's mansion just a couple of blocks from here. He was, of course, disappointed that the Republicans failed to carry his home state of Maryland. It was that, and the perplexing votes from some of the big states, which filled so many people here with some doubt, with fear that they had perhaps lost it again. Much of those doubts have passed now, with the electoral vote almost within Richard Nixon's grasp. If the Republicans win, Agnew will spend the rest of the week here, working on the transition of state power to a new governor, probably a Democrat to be chosen by the Democratic-controlled state legislature. and then he plans a vacation, probably a week or two in the Virgin Islands. This is Charles Quinn, NBC News, in the Statler Hilton at Annapolis.
More election news coverage in just a moment. Right now, the time is 23 minutes before the hour. And here's Hugh with what we think is a very happy message.
Yes, a couple of times each week, Barbara and Frank and Joe and myself take a minute to talk with you about the big lift drink, milk. I can't think of a more wholesome, healthy, and happy kind of beverage to talk about. Milk is truly like apple pie and corn on the cob and mother, those things. It's everything good. Sometimes I think we ought to take it a little more seriously, because your health and your family's health is the most important thing in the world. And here we have nature's most nearly perfect food to help you stay healthy, to give you a big lift that lasts. You see, when you drink milk with meals and snacks, you don't just get quick energy. You get energy and vitality to get you going and keep you going. And here's the important thing to remember. Most adults still need to drink milk, at least 2 full glasses every day. Now, if you aren't a milk drinker, you are missing something. You're missing a big lift that lasts. The American Dairy Association hopes that you'll enjoy milk today. Now back to Frank, more news.
The Democrats easily retain control of both houses of Congress. In the Senate that takes office in January, there will be 58 Democrats and 42 Republicans. 2 veteran Democratic senators, Mulroney of Oklahoma and Clark of Pennsylvania, lost their seats, and Republicans also won in Florida and Maryland. In one of the highly publicized Senate races, Alan Cranston, a Democrat, beat out Max Rafferty, a conservative Republican, in California. Cranston will take the seat held by Thomas Kuchel, the liberal Republican who lost to Rafferty in a bitter primary race. Barry Goldwater won a Senate seat in Arizona that had been held for many years by 91-year-old Carl Hayden, who retired. Goldwater's returning to Capitol Hill 4 years after his defeat by Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 presidential campaign. In the contests for governors, Republicans took over in 7 state houses formerly held by Democrats, and 2 Democrats defeated Republican incumbents. A Republican won in Vermont, where the Democratic governor did not run for re-election. Republicans also won in New Hampshire, Delaware, Indiana, Iowa, and West Virginia. Democrats won Rhode Island and Montana. That brings us to almost 20 minutes before the hour. And now here is Barbara with a word about the National Observer.
Thank you, Frank. Certainly today, but every day in today's fast-paced world, women must be able to talk about a lot more than just babies and recipes. And that's why so many women have found the National Observer to be just what the doctor ordered. It's a new kind of national weekly newspaper for the whole family. And quickly and quietly, without scare headlines, it keeps you informed on the nation and the world, the arts and sciences, books, sports, travel, entertainment, elections, and much more. The National Observer not only tells you what is happening, but also why. And you'll also find that the National Observer will provide your whole family with a lot of news you can use, practical news, to help you get more out of living. And if you act today, you can get advantage of the special trial subscription offer. The next 20 weekly issues sent to your home for only $2.67. You send no money, just your name and address to the National Observer, Box 88, New York, New York, 10017. That's the National Observer, Box 88, New York, New York, 10017. Hugh?
Frank has more news for us in a moment. No? Well, he will have shortly, as we keep you posted on the goings-on here in Election Central and across the nation. A little bit later, we want to get a chance again to talk with John Chancellor, whom you heard at the beginning of this half hour, also with Ed Newman and Sander Vanoker on several subjects. We're going to deal a little bit more with the missing precinct tallies that we've talked about, which appear to have brought things to a momentary standstill. We also want to get a little bit of a breakdown for you as to income groups, how they voted, to what extent the war was an issue in analyzing the returns, possible breakdown of ethnic votes and whether civil rights was as much of an issue as it was not at each convention. Many surprises in the way, both in the turnout and the composition of that turnout. We'll talk to these men about that very shortly. If Frank doesn't have more news at this time, we're going to have another little message for you in a couple of minutes. To give you the time, it's 18 minutes before the hour now. Why don't we give you that message right now? You know, nowadays everybody's watching calories and what he eats.
Richard Nixon, at this moment, is within a hair's breadth of victory in the 1968 presidential election. The Republican now needs only 9 votes in the Electoral College to defeat Hubert Humphrey. With 92% of the popular vote counted, each major party candidate has 43%, although Nixon is slightly in the lead. There are 4 states still undecided, and Nixon could become the 37th president of the United States if he won in any one of 3 of them, Missouri, Illinois, or Texas. Humphrey, on the other hand, must carry all of these states, all 4 of them, all 3 of them, and 1 more, Alaska, to win the 270 Electoral College votes needed. George Wallace has carried 5 states and won 14% of the popular vote. Among Nixon's aides, there is a feeling of jubilation. A report from Herbert Kaplow at Nixon headquarters in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City.
Yeah.
They're not quite ready there at the Waldorf Astoria. We'll go back there a little later on, probably in this hour. In the meantime, we'll go on with this. Humphrey had made his last public appearance at his headquarters in Minneapolis at 2:30 in the morning, and he said that he was optimistic about the outcome.
Some members of my family have already seen fit to retire in confidence, and others have decided to stay up. But we have, as you know, several of the very important states that are nip and tuck, where the decision, I'm sure, will not be known until sometime at least late tomorrow. And if you want to stay up to wait for all of that, I'm all for you. But you've been watching the television, and you've been listening to the reports. And I believe that it's fair to say that we have done much better than most observers had thought we would, and about as good as I thought we would. Now, I tell you, you know me, and you know that I'm generally a rather optimistic man. And tonight I feel that way. I feel that this election has been not only a rewarding experience for me, but I feel that by the time that the turn of day comes tomorrow, that you and I are going to be a lot happier and much more cheerful than we are even tonight. Thank you very much.
But among Hubert Humphrey's aides, there is now a feeling of dejection and despair. Jack Perkins reports from Humphrey headquarters in Minneapolis.
Well, the day did turn, and it is cold and bleak in Minneapolis, and we have not heard from Mr. Humphrey since that optimistic statement of last night. We were told last night that by this hour he might have something to say, or at least the press should start gathering and be alert and ready. So we are here and alert and ready, and he is not here yet. He probably, one must assume, will not say anything yet until there is something decisive to say. To speculate would be perhaps a little improper or unnecessary as to what Mr. Humphrey will do if he does not win this election now. Immediately, he will probably go back home to Waverly sometime today. It's about an hour away from here. Maybe back to Washington. He had planned to go to the Virgin Islands for a week or two. He'd been thinking about that if he won. But now we understand Spiro Agnew has made reservations for the Virgin Islands. So we can't say what his immediate plans will be. He has said, when asked in the past what he would do if he lost this election, he has said he would like to write, maybe his memoirs. He would like to teach political science. He would like to travel and be a free spirit. We don't know whether he is contemplating these things yet this morning or not. He probably has much more immediate problems on his mind, like Illinois, Missouri, and Texas. Jack Perkins, NBC News, at Humphrey headquarters in Minneapolis.
We'll have more election coverage and news for you in just a moment. This is Today on NBC.
The projected winner in 30 states with 287 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey, the projected winner in 13 states with 166 electoral votes. And that's the NBC News checkmark. Nixon, the projected winner with 47% of the Illinois vote, 93% of the precincts in Illinois having reported, and our human reckoners having decided in their wisdom that Illinois goes to Nixon. 287 electoral votes.
John, this is Ed Newman. May I say something?
Yes.
I think it should perhaps be explained that that burst of applause our audience may have heard was not an expression of partisan political sentiment by NBC. That was applause for the young man who was putting the check up next to Nixon in Illinois, and it was perhaps an expression of relief more than of support. We're nonpartisan, and I guess we ought to make that clear.
Well, I think it's just 16 hours and 4 minutes since we started this tallying here. But now we find that Richard Milhouse Nixon, 55 years old, of New York, is going to be the 37th President of the United States. That Spiro Theodore Agnew of Maryland, 49 years old, is the Vice President-elect. They will serve with a Democratic Congress, as we've seen decided here. The Illinois vote was late. We still do not have projected winners in Alaska, Missouri, or Texas, as far as I can say, but Nixon is over the line. Not since 1916 has a president won in the Electoral College with fewer than 300 electoral votes. Wilson won in 1916 with 277, McKinley back in 1900 with 292, and in those days you needed fewer electoral votes to win. The last time Richard Nixon had his name mentioned in the Electoral College, he had 219 electoral votes when he lost to John Kennedy, who had 303 in 1960. But this year, Nixon has prevailed. He's the president-elect with 287 electoral votes, with 28,984,648 popular votes tallied now. 43% of the vote to Hubert Humphrey's 28,794,376 votes, 43%. Wallace at 14%, not counting for much in this election, which has now been concluded. And I believe that Herbert Kaplow, the NBC correspondent who for so long has covered Richard Nixon, is here in New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Nixon headquarters, and I wonder if he'd come in now.
Well, Jack, we are waiting for a news conference here which obviously will deal with the subject you people have just pointed out, the Illinois vote, which you just called for Nixon, and which turned the tide for him and gave him the position of being president-elect. And it just occurred to me that 8 years ago, just about this time of morning, in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, there was another news conference with at least one of the two personalities to appear here shortly, Herb Klein, at which time they, in effect, conceded that election, and also on the basis of a 9,000 adverse margin in the state of Illinois. So there are several parallels that are, I suppose, 180-degree turns from then. The two men who were supposed to come are Klein and another press aide to Mr. Nixon, Ron Ziegler, and we suspect that they have also waited to see just how NBC would call this, along with the other news media. And one of the Nixon people just came up to me a moment ago and said, is it so that you folks have just called Illinois for Nixon? We said yes, and he went back to report it, I suppose, to his superiors.
Herbert?
Yes.
Sandra Van Oker.
Yes, Andy, hi.
How are you?
Fine, I'm tired.
That'll get you no sympathy here. Why do you think Mr. Nixon hasn't come down? Do you think he wants to prepare it by using Herb Klein to prepare the atmosphere? Do you think he wants to wait for maybe Missouri? Over 300?
No, I just think he wanted to button down Illinois. I just think he wanted to button down the election before he comes down. And I think it probably will not be too long.
Herb, this is Ed Newman. May I make a point to you?
By all means.
Seems to me that this is a particularly critical time in Nixon's life, and it's of enormous importance to him what he says at this time. The whole country's watching, the whole world is watching. It's a moment when I think he has to be gracious in victory and try to unite the country behind him, and the country's plainly divided.
Yes.
Popular vote shows that. So far, we've got Nixon with about 42.8% of the vote, Humphrey with 42.5% of the vote. So this is a very ticklish moment for Nixon, in spite of the fact that it is a victorious moment for him. Isn't that true?
Yes, and aside from that, Ed, his whole campaign to win the nomination and win the election has been predicated on the idea of I am the man who can bring the country together at this time when we have such deep and complex problems. So
let's remember that he himself predicted a popular vote margin for himself of between 3 and 5 million. And he's not going to come anywhere near that, is he?
No, what is it? Is it going to be something under 300,000?
Well, at the moment it's slightly under 200,000.
I suspect what he will do, I would be almost certain that when he does appear, that the first, after going through the amenities of thanking his workers, if many of the workers get back here, you know, everybody was here until about 4 o'clock and then broke away and probably will come back. After thanking them and going through the usual pep talk, I suspect that the main part of his remarks will be directed at this idea of everybody getting back together again. I'm sure that he will express his appreciation, express his thoughts about Vice President Humphrey. And I think from here on in, the whole pitch is going to be, let's bring everybody together. That's what he campaigned on, and now we see that's how he won, however narrow a margin.
Herb, have the Nixon advisors and Mr. Nixon thought at all about this question of being a minority president? It is not a severe thing. If I remember rightly, I think John F. Kennedy had less than a majority when he won the election in 1960.
He had a 113,000 vote majority.
Yeah, and I think it was less than 50%. It was 49 point something. Have they thought about how they meet this problem? Nixon himself has talked frequently about problems like this. I don't know that they've been able to establish any, reach any conclusions that they feel would work. But yes, it has been in their minds. In fact, whatever Wallace got, which was what, about 15%? I'm sorry, I missed that. What did Wallace get, about 15%? 14% right now. 14? Yeah. Well, I think they would consider that to be not an insignificant expression of sentiment, something that would, as a matter of fact, somewhere back in the remarks of the last couple of weeks, I seem to have a recollection of somebody in official capacity, if not Nixon himself, noting that 14, 15% would be that is a segment of our population whose sentiment has to be considered. This is not to say that they're going to, kowtow to it, but they recognize it as something that could be a problem. Herb, can you stand by for a minute? We want to go down to Edwin Newman. We'll get back to you
by all means, sure.
Ed?
Thank you, Sandy. Well, we've had an extraordinary four or so hours to go through waiting for this decision finally to be made, the decision that Richard Nixon is the president-elect of the United States, as he now is. If you go back a bit, you go back to the vote in California, when California swung to Nixon, that was the beginning of the end. That was one of the key states that he needed, and conversely that Humphrey needed. And we declared California for Nixon at 7:49 Eastern Time. And we followed that by declaring Ohio for Nixon at 7:50 Eastern Time, 1 minute later. And there, within 2 minutes, he'd picked up a very large number of votes, and it looked as though he would go over the top very quickly. And then we had a delay that went on for very nearly 3 hours, during which I imagine questions were arising in many people's minds about what was holding up the vote in the remaining key states of Missouri, Texas, and Illinois. Finally, a few minutes ago, we were able to declare Illinois for Nixon. That put him over the top. That gave him the majority of electoral votes that he needed, 287, 17 more than required. What was holding up Illinois, we still don't know. To this moment, we don't know what is still holding up Missouri. We still don't know where, incidentally, Hubert Humphrey is still slightly ahead. We still don't know what's holding up the state of Texas, where Hubert Humphrey is still slightly ahead. The state of Alaska is not nearly so much of a problem for two reasons. It's a very large state with relatively few people, and it takes longer to collect the votes there. And in the second place, it can't be a crucial state because it doesn't have enough electoral votes to be. Nixon needed, toward the end, either Missouri, Texas, or Illinois. He's got Illinois. He may still get Missouri and Texas. That remains to be seen. In any case, he has enough. Now here's John Chancellor.
Look at the popular vote board to show you just how close this election is.Ose percentage points for Nixon and Humphrey don't really go far enough, the 43%, 43%. Actually, if you tally that vote, Nixon has 42.8% of the vote, and Humphrey has 42.5% of the vote. The 190,000 vote lead that Nixon has over Humphrey represents about 0.28 of 1% of the total popular vote recorded so far. And this is interesting and quite interesting in politics. It was just reversed 8 years ago. John Kennedy had 49.7, Nixon had 49.5. And the margin of difference was down to the 100th, exactly the same, except that it is reversed this time. I wonder if we could have a look at Illinois. The vote has advanced in Illinois, but the lead which Humphrey is holding, which Nixon is holding in Illinois, is exactly the same. A few minutes ago, with lower figures than this, fewer votes being counted, the lead was 116,000, and I think now the lead, Nixon's lead, is 116,000, and this supports our projected winner thesis that Nixon has indeed, with 93% of the precincts in, won Illinois' 26 electoral votes, which put him over the top.
John?
Yes.
And Ed, a lot of people, I think, are waking up now on the West Coast. I'm sure a lot of people went to bed around 1 or 2 o'clock. And I think I was thinking about this when Ed was talking. It might be worthwhile to just mention again how at one time in the early hours this morning, you could see on the face of Professor Paul Freund, the Harvard constitutional expert, the mirror of a first-class constitutional crisis in the making. And all of us in this studio were reflecting on that. Now, it's over now. But about 8 hours ago, we thought we had a full-fledged constitutional crisis in the making.
And I think there's one very important point to be made, now that everybody is relieved that we won't have to go through a constitutional crisis.
Can I get it?
The tendency is going to be to forget it. The tendency is going to be, well, it didn't happen. The American system in terms of the Electoral College is basically sound. We won't have to worry about this happening again. The next president will be more popular. But I think everybody ought to remember the agonizing hours we went through around dawn today here in the East, when it began to look very much as a reasonable possibility that this would have to be settled in the House of Representatives. And as I think I said earlier, that this great constitutional pigeon would come home to roost.
Well, John, let me make a point about this, if I may. It is a fact that the constitutional crisis has been avoided. As you say, this is a point that's going to be made in an attempt to forget about this whole question. But it's very interesting that it has been avoided in an election this close, in which, as you were saying, the difference between Nixon and Humphrey was roughly 1 vote out of every 400. And in addition to that, George Wallace was, I suppose, the strongest third-party candidate of all time, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't really a third-party candidate, really a second Republican candidate. And nevertheless, in spite of the closeness of the vote between Nixon and Humphrey and the presence of George Wallace in the election, the constitutional crisis has been avoided. Now, that's a pretty good argument, I think, and I think it's going to vitiate a lot of the drive for a reform of the Constitution so that this possibility will not occur again.
Ed, I don't think so. You know, they used to say God protects drunks, babies in the United States of America, but a lot of people have had their hearts chilled by this experience. And you know, in the Congress over the years, there have been reform efforts made by a body of people, Carl Mont, a Republican, John F. Kennedy when he was a senator, to do this. I think there is going to be a movement for reform. Now, like all great changes in a country like ours, they will not come quickly. However, they will come.
Sandy, I think that we ought to add that it wasn't just Karl Mont, and it hasn't been people in this century, that in 1824, a committee of the United States Senate argued for the abolition of the Electoral College, and they made what seems to me then is the argument we ought to use now. that electors, these faceless people who have so much to do with the choosing of our presidents, if they do their job, they're useless. If they don't do their job, they're dangerous. I see no reason for having them. I don't know if we take partisan positions on this, but the vagaries of the Electoral College almost brought us into crisis this time, and I do think something ought to be done about it.
Well, John, I think that phrase is unanswerable. If the electors do their job, they're useless. If they don't do their job, they're dangerous. I quite agree. All I'm saying is that I think that the constitutional crisis, having been avoided in so phenomenally close an election, may take a lot of the drive out of the campaign to bring about constitutional reform, which is difficult to bring about at the best of times, in the best of circumstances, and even on questions that everybody approves of, or virtually everybody approves of.
Gentlemen,
but we'll see. What's the point? The point is that Richard Nixon is now the president-elect of the United States. Sandy, did you have a...
They want to break away for just a second. We may have to go over to Mr. Nixon's news conference just to take a quick look at some Senate races that are as yet undecided. If we can look at the Senate board, first the state of Iowa. Governor Harold Hughes, that race is just too close to call. Over state legislator Dave Stanley, that is just too close to call. It's about 500 vote difference. In the state of Oregon, where Senator Wayne Morris is seeking a 5th term, he has been behind all night state legislator Robert Packwood. That vote percentage is 2% with 83% of the vote in. In the state of Ohio, Congressman John Gilligan from Cincinnati has been trailing Attorney General William Saxby all night. 2 percentage points separate them. That race is too close to call. And in Alaska, the state last to report in, we have Mike Gravel leading his Republican opponent, Elmer Rasmussen, by a fairly substantial margin. The man last is Senator Ernest Greening, who was the incumbent. He was beaten by Gravel in the primary, and he was trying to organize a write-in campaign, which is illegal unless the courts rule otherwise. So we have those 4 Senate races left undecided. John?
Nixon's communications director, used to call them press agents, Herb Klein, has not yet made an official statement on the now projected victory. We are not alone in that projection of Richard Nixon as the president-elect. So we're holding on that. But it would be interesting, we think, to take you to Minneapolis, to the Leamington Hotel, see what the mood is at the headquarters of Hubert Humphrey, and see if we can get our correspondent, Jack Perkins.
Jack, there was a sign held by one of the supporters in Los Angeles last Monday during the day. It said, "Hold on, baby, you've come a long way." Well, Mr. Humphrey has come a long way. In the last couple of weeks, it was a fantastic comeback. But it was not enough. He will be down here, we expect, within an hour or two. He got up about 45 minutes ago, we're told, having slept about 4 hours. He got up and now is, of course, aware of the projections and the situation. And so he will be here to make a statement. We don't know exactly what he will say, but we know what he has said the last couple of days about this campaign. Lines like this. Win or lose, he said yesterday, win or lose, I consider this campaign the most gratifying achievement of my political career. Last night he said, we've done much better than some of the experts thought we would, as indeed they have. And he said he'd like to thank the people of this country. They have given us, he said, a great vote of confidence in this popular vote. As it turned out, of course, as the way the votes were counted and the projections were made, it was Illinois that put Richard Nixon over. And this irony is not lost on some of the Humphrey people. This is not to say the vice president himself, but some of his supporters and friends who felt the convention never should have been held in Chicago, that the convention that Richard Daley arranged and held there was too much of a burden for them to ever overcome. And as one of them said with some bitterness in the early hours of this morning, Dick Daley lost this election for us. As we said, Mr. Humphrey will be down here to speak for himself, we believe within an hour or so. Jack Perkins, NBC News, at Humphrey headquarters in Minneapolis.
And that is a report from the SAD headquarters, the losers' headquarters. The feeling was in the polling community, pardon me, among many observers of this election that at least in the popular vote, if not in the electoral vote, if the election had been held a week, 10 days after the 5th of November, that Hubert Humphrey might very well have won it. And I think Jack Perkins makes a point we'll hear a great deal of, and I'd like to question my colleagues on this, Sander, the factor of the Chicago Convention and that disruptive and unhappy convention. Did you hear in your travels this year many of the Humphrey people saying that they regretted what had happened at Chicago, Sander?
I didn't hear any of the Humphrey people say they regretted what happened in Chicago. That does not mean they approved what happened there. But I don't remember any occasion when they regretted. I suppose, and this is a subjective thought on my part, that many of them wished it had not exactly been held in Chicago. They wished that those things had not happened.
I did it.
It did cause divisions within the party. But I heard that earlier, and I can't really remember who said it. I guess it was Jack Perkins in the early hours of this morning, John. In any event, I don't know how much that affected the vote in Illinois. I think that was the context in which it was raised. Look, for as many people disliked what happened in Chicago, I found in my travels covering senatorial candidates that as many people who disliked what happened, I found 2 people who liked what happened there. In fact, I found the majority of the people approved what Mayor Daley had done. And I'm not at all sure that some of the drift away from George Wallace to the Democrats might have been occasioned by what had happened in Chicago. They took a very firm and approving view of the demonstration of law and order in Chicago.
I think that's a very sophisticated viewpoint. I think you're right. I think a number of people in this country who were for Hubert Humphrey or equally against Nixon will be making Daley the scapegoat for this, and I'm not sure that that's absolutely true. I think that one of the things that people did observe about the Humphrey candidacy was that there had been little pre-convention preparation for a full campaign, and it took them quite some time to get started. This shouldn't diminish the almost miraculous performance of the vice president in bringing his popular vote up to the staggering percentage he got. Not since Woodrow Wilson's election has a candidate won the presidency of the United States with a smaller share of the popular vote than Richard Nixon here today.
John, I don't know. I hope this doesn't sound gratuitous. I don't mean it to be, but as you remember, and you remember Ed at the convention, the problem was that was never Hubert Humphrey's convention. And somehow, if there is any comfort in defeat and any comfort in the magnificent recovery he made, it must come from the fact that he is once again his own man. I say again, I hope that doesn't sound gratuitous. I think everyone will know how I mean it. But he has become again the master of himself. The man whom we saw several hours ago radiating optimism. And you remember that time when he said, all of you know I'm an optimistic man. That was the essential Hubert Humphrey. He started with tremendous handicaps in this campaign because the convention was not his, the beginning of the campaign was not his, but finally he became his own man.